before the news, before the King Charles friendship gesture, as I would call it, the Greeks were furious with Rishi Sunak for the insult. All the Greek political parties condemned the cancellation as a principle against the institution of the Greek Prime Minister. And the Greeks were calling all kind of names, as you mentioned, the Greek tabloid.
When we hear George Osborne say that there are solutions there to be found, these are what we've been given to understand, negotiations ongoing between the British Museum and the Greek government. Is something like a loan permitted within the British Museum Act? Could the British Museum, and I believe this is what has been touted, say, OK, we're going to allow the marbles to travel to Athens to be exhibited alongside the rest of the Parthenon frieze. And in exchange, the Greek archaeologists will give pieces to the British Museum, or lend pieces to the British Museum that have never left Greece before, for example. So people in the UK will have an opportunity to go and visit pieces that you would only have previously seen if you travel to Athens. So would that be possible within the British Museum Act?
Well, it is certainly a very tantalizing prospect, isn't it? So under the terms of the British Museum Act 1963, it is obviously possible to lend items. So the trustees can lend items from the collection, sometimes for a very long period of time. However, they have to make sure that the items themselves are fit to travel, so they're not too delicate. That's one thing. And that there's no risk that they won't be returned at the end of the loan period. So those would be the conditions placed upon a long-term loan. Now, we have to keep in mind that they have sent out many items on loan over the last number of years. There are about 3,000 to 4,000 items out on loan from the trustees at any given time. Many of those go internationally as well. So there are items owned by the trustees of the British Museum that are out there in the world today. And that would be the basis upon which I think George Osborne and the other negotiators are trying to seek a settlement, some kind of arrangement that where they could give meaningful access to the Greeks to part of the collection, possibly eventually the whole collection, but it would have to be within the terms of the British Museum Act 1963. Therefore, it would have to be on the basis of some kind of loan arrangement or something similar.
In your view, is this realistic? Because from what we know, and certainly what I know from reading the Greek press, is that the issue is not so much, well, of course it is where they're exhibited. The argument was made by Kyriakos Mitsotakis that I think he used the metaphor, it's like ripping the Mona Lisa in half and having it exhibited in two different places. But the argument of ownership is really important to the Greek government and the Greek people. So the idea that someone will say, we will loan you the Parthenon sculptures back, do you think that's got wings? Will it be able to fly with the Greek government?
You're right. I mean, they've often said in Greece that the L word is death. So you don't want to accept a loan because you're actually asking to borrow back something that many people think belongs to you spiritually, let's say, if not technically legally. So that's always going to be a political problem on the Greek side. So if there is a negotiated settlement, it will have to address that point regardless. I mean, there will have to be some kind of situation that will be acceptable to the Greek side. So in order to reach a resolution, each side is going to have to give a little in order to get a little. I think that's the basic premise of any kind of negotiation, but certainly it applies in this case. But that's definitely something that is going to have to be addressed. There are potentially other legal mechanisms that can be used where you don't have to use the term loan. You could think of a bailment, you could think of a deposit. There are others, and I explore these in my recent book, The Parthenon Marbles Dispute. So it is possible to find some other solution, but it will be a very delicate thing. And so it'll be up to the parties to make sure that whatever the agreement is, that it deals with these things properly and sufficiently.
Alexander, just briefly before we go, is the British Museum Act bulletproof? What do I mean by that? Particularly in the case of the marbles, which weren't acquired by a government. They were acquired by an individual, albeit he was the British ambassador, but he wasn't acquiring them on behalf of the British government. He was acquiring them on behalf of himself. He saw an opportunity. He intended to exhibit the marbles in a private museum, with some of the marbles even ending up in his own private estate. So he wasn't acting on behalf of a government, and he bought them off an occupier of the country of Greece, the Ottoman Empire. Is there a legal case, perhaps, for the marbles, which actually will break them out of the British Museum Act to say, look, the methods by which these were acquired were not, if you like, legitimate. There's all going sort of arguments about the bill of sale. I think there's only one Italian translation version of it. Is there a legal issue which actually could unlock the marbles from the British Museum Act, or is that just wishful thinking from the Greeks?
With all due respect, my view is that is wishful thinking, because I mean, I think on balance, there was sufficient permission for Lord Elgin to do what he did. Morally, a lot of problems with what he did because Greece was ruled by the Ottomans at the time. But I think legally, he probably had sufficient permission to do what he did. But regardless of that, the most important thing is that you have an act of parliament from 1816, as I mentioned at the outset, that vests title in the trustees. So parliament vested title, that means that title is very clearly vested in the trustees, and there's nothing that a court, for example, could ever do to overturn that. So I think we're kind of stuck with the legal position. The question is, can the parties seek some kind of settlement on an ethical basis that would give meaningful access to this collection in Greece?
Wonderful. Alexander, thank you so much. It's been really enlightening speaking to you. Alexander is the author of The Parthenon Marbles Dispute and the director of the Institute of Art and Law. That's Alexander Herman. Now, let's have a little look-see to how all these events this week have gone down in Greece. I'm joined by Evdoxia Lymperi, the London correspondent of ERT, which is the Hellenic Broadcasting Corporation. Evdoxia, kalimera.
Kalispera.
Kalispera.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Evdoxia, I've caught wind of a few of the Greek press. This has not gone down that well. One of the Greek newspapers is not one of the most popular ones, but it had a picture of Rishi Sunak on the cover and some words in English, which nor you nor I can repeat on We can on radio or TV. Really quite rude. It's not gone down well, has it?
Not at all. It hasn't gone down well. In Greece, people are enthusiastic, of course, now about the Thai diplomacy of King Charles for his visit to COP28. They believe it's a signal of support to Greece. They have moved a little bit now.
Let's explain that just for people who might have missed it. It's sure. The front cover of the Times as well. And it's that King Charles appearing in Dubai. There's also a wonderful picture of him talking to Rishi Sunak, standing face to face. And he is wearing a tie which is unmistakably covered by the Greek flag. I know a lot of royal correspondents have said, no, it's just a pattern of crosses and lines. No, it isn't. I've had a good look at it from various different angles. It's a tie with the Greek flag repeated over and over and over again as the pattern.
Yes, it's woven. It's many Greek ties woven in the tie. It's not printed. It's a very luxurious tie that he bought. I mean, it belongs to. It comes from a store in Athens. They believe anyway. The people in Greece now believe it's a signal of support to Greece after the sudden cancellation of the meeting between Sunak and Mitsotakis. It was broadly reported in the British press, as you very well said, in the Times as well, as that the king, during his big speech, not only when he met Sunak, but during his big speech at the Global Climate Summit, wore this tie. So the Greek people are now happy. They moved a little bit from this anger, and the tie, as I said before the news, before they see King Charles. Friendship gesture, as I would call it. The Greeks were furious with Rishi Sunak for the insult. All the Greek political parties condemned the cancellation as a principle against the institution, the Greek prime minister. And the Greeks were calling all kinds of names, as you mentioned, the Greek tabloid.
Evdoxia, how is Rishi Sunak viewed from the Greek government now? Because I heard quite a lot of comments from officials saying, well, actually, they started mentioning his polling, for example, and starting excusing and saying, well, actually, this perhaps is Rishi Sunak trying to appear in control when he's behind the polls. How do they see him as a prime minister?
As a prime minister, they see him as a weak prime minister after his this diplomatic mischief. Actually, it was a mistake. It was they called it many names. The Greek government now doesn't talk anymore about the issue for 2 days now. They leave it as it is. The last statement we heard from the Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis was on Friday and said, "We've said everything we have to say." After the disruption, also, it's worth to say to mention that. Acropolis Museum was positioned saying, among other things, that culture is not only antiquities and works of art. Culture is also the relationships and behaviors of people. And that gives you a sense of, it reflects the general sense in the Greek public. Also, Mr. Mitsotakis said that when he visited the president, Katerina Sakelaropoulou, he said that in his belief, the move will not hurt relations between Greece and Britain in the longer term, at least, adding that Greece's demand for the reunification of the Parthenon sculptures had received that way more publicity than ever expected due to the turmoil. The UK Prime Minister accused Mitsotakis of failing to comply with an agreement not to comment on the historical artifacts, sometimes referred to as the Elgin Marbles, of course, with Greek officials saying there was no such deal. They denied categorically. Mitsotakis spoke. He spoke with Keir Starmer as we again in the summit of COP28 for the climate. We saw some pictures there. They were both smiling. And now, two things. Diplomatic analysts, as I said, talk about a strange, misplaced, and unnecessary behavior from Rishi Sunak.
Okay.
Some others, it's interesting, they relate the incident with the possible sale of Eurofighters from Britain to Turkey.
Oh.
And lastly, I will mention the thing that you were talking earlier with Alexander. Archaeologists insist that they are not looking for an agreement with the British Museum. Archaeologists in Greece, right?
Yeah.
Because the only thing that can be done without changing the law is for them to give the sculptures through a loan, and this is a red line for Greece. There is a third road, a third way, and more appropriate, as they call it, for a new British piece of legislation called the Charity Act, which is a third way, not to change the 1963 law, but to create a new Charity Act, which would allow the sculptures to be removed in Athens.
Okay. Evdoxia, I have to leave it there for time constraints. Thank you so much, as ever, for speaking to us. Evdoxia Lymperi, she's the London correspondent for ERT, which is the Hellenic Broadcasting Corporation.